The rifle was too big for her hands. She flinched as the cowboy placed it gently into her grip. Sunlight danced on the Texas dust, and behind her other Japanese women watched silently, unsure if this was a test or a trick. "Pull it to your shoulder," the cowboy said, his voice calm, not mocking. "You're not gonna break it. Just breathe." The girl swallowed. She had cleaned rifles, carried stretchers, whispered prayers over dying men, but she had never been invited to hold a weapon. Not like this, not with laughter in the air, not with safety all around her. When she finally pulled the trigger, the sound cracked across the sky like thunder. A tin can flew off the fence post. The cowboys cheered, tipping their hats. She blinked, stunned, and slowly just barely smiled. This wasn't the war she remembered. And this moment? It would unravel everything she thought she knew. The tin can wobbled once on the fence post, then fell backward into the dust with a soft thump. The air hung in silence for half a second, then erupted with cowboy whoops and hat-waving cheers, as if they'd just watched a 4th of July fireworks finale instead of a Japanese POW fire her first shot. The girl who had pulled the trigger, barely 18, a former army nurse from Hiroshima, stood frozen. The rifle's butt still pressed awkwardly to her shoulder, her knees locked, her eyes wide. She didn't know whether to laugh, drop the gun, or run. The other women watched from the edge of the dusty field, silent as ghosts. They lined the shade under the eaves of a corral fence, their khaki uniforms faded and oversized, sleeves rolled and fraying. Some held tin cups of water. One woman clutched a comb like a weapon. The scene before them was not what they'd prepared for. They'd heard rumors about this American ranch, stories whispered in the dark of boxcars and shipping holds. But no one had said anything about guns. Not in this way. Out in the field, a line of old milk cans stood like rusted sentinels, balanced on hay bales and fence posts. Rifles rested on a crate, long, wooden-stocked, gleaming faintly in the sun. The cowboys treated the whole thing like an afternoon pastime. One was chewing a piece of straw. Another was lighting a cigarette with one hand and adjusting a woman's stance with the other, gently nudging her elbow as though she were holding a fishing rod. Not a weapon. "Just squeeze the trigger, not pull it," he said, calm as a windless afternoon. "Let the rifle do the work." But the women didn't move. Not at first. To them, this was not just a game. It was a line they had never been allowed to cross. Back in Japan, even male civilians weren't trusted with weapons. Guns were sacred instruments of state-sanctioned violence, never toys, never hobbies, and certainly never given to women. To touch one had been a violation of everything they were taught about duty, loyalty, and gender. So to be invited by the enemy to hold one, to fire one, it was almost too much. The girl who'd shot the can lowered her rifle slowly, her hands shaking now more than before the shot. One of the cowboys, a tall man with sunburned skin and a voice like gravel, gave her a nod and a crooked grin. "Not bad for a first try," he said. She didn't respond. Her ears were still ringing, but her grip on the gun had loosened. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what it was. Not yet. Back in the shade, another woman stepped forward. A nurse named Mizuki. She was older, maybe 25, with high cheekbones and a scar on her left wrist. Without a word, she walked toward the crate. The other women watched her as if she were marching toward a firing squad. She picked up a rifle. Her jaw was tight. A cowboy moved to help her with her stance, but she waved him off. "I watched men do this," she said flatly, her accent thick. "Now I try." She aimed with the stiff posture of someone mimicking a memory. The shot cracked. Dust exploded from behind a tin can. She missed. She didn't flinch. She handed the rifle back and walked away without a word. No one clapped. But it was a beginning. By the end of the hour, 5 women had tried. 1 hit her target. 2 laughed nervously after missing. 1 dropped the rifle after the shot and burst into tears. No one was mocked. The cowboys handed out water. 1 offered a stick of gum. A young POW named Hannah stood beside the fence, watching with arms crossed. She leaned toward the girl next to her and whispered, "If they taught us to shoot back home, maybe we wouldn't have lost." The words hung in the air like smoke. Behind them, the Texas wind stirred the dust, and a hawk circled silently overhead. The firing range had become something unexpected, not a place of fear, not quite freedom, but something in between. A threshold. And though no one said it aloud, every woman standing there knew this wasn't just target practice. It was the sound of something breaking loose. But before that sound ever rang across the dry wind of Texas, before the rifles and the tin cans and the slow unwinding of everything they thought they knew, there had been silence. A kind of cultivated silence, deep and bone level. Not just the silence of obedience, but the silence of having no voice to begin with. In wartime Japan, the girls had learned to disappear early. Most were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were Taishintai Volunteer Corps, though there was little volunteering in the matter. They folded bandages, carried the wounded, filed reports no one would ever read. Their duty was to serve without question, to sacrifice without complaint, to vanish behind the uniforms of men who fought and died in their name. Guns were for warriors. Women were taught to carry shame like another limb. Mizuki, the one with the scar, had once typed requisition orders in an underground bunker near Osaka. Her commanding officer never used her name, only snapped his fingers when he wanted something. The only time she saw a rifle up close was when a wounded private was dragged in, blood pumping from his side. She had reached instinctively to help hold the weapon as they shifted the boy onto a stretcher. The corporal had slapped her hand away. "That's not for you," he barked. "Women don't touch steel." The phrase stayed with her. Women don't touch steel. For others, it had been even more rigid. Hana, who stood tall and spoke little, had grown up in a Tokyo household where her father kept a katana above the family shrine. Her mother bowed to it every morning. When the war began, her brothers went off to serve, and she was handed a pamphlet instead, a faded booklet titled "The Dignity of the Woman's Role." It was filled with images of smiling girls wrapping bandages, delivering rice balls, kneeling beside wounded soldiers. None of them ever held a weapon. They were the quiet strength behind the blade, never the blade itself. What made it harder was how much they believed it. They had all been fed the same mythology, thick with Bushido, soaked in sacrifice. To die for the emperor was honorable. To be captured was disgrace. And to survive captivity as a woman, unthinkable. The enemy would shame you, use you, destroy your soul before taking your body. At least, that's what they were told. So when the surrender came, it wasn't relief they felt. It was erasure. The war ended not with a bang, but with a silence that fell over the country like ash. Officers disappeared, orders stopped, and in the hospital wards and signal towers, the women stood still, staring at each other, waiting for someone to explain what came next. No one did. They were rounded up days later, first with apology, then with barked commands. Japanese soldiers, now stripped of rank and certainty, herded them to the docks like sheep. "The Americans will take you," one man muttered without meeting their eyes. "Pray they don't take everything else." The ship that came for them didn't look like a prison. It looked like a cargo freighter. But inside, the metal walls were lined with bunks and canvas stretchers. They were not shackled. They were not beaten. But the silence remained. In the hold, they clutched their bags if they had any and their breath. No one spoke above a whisper. No one slept easily. The sea stretched forever. Kiyomi, the youngest among them, counted the bolts in the wall of the ship to stay sane. Her father had died in Manchuria. Her mother had sold her comb for rice. Now she was floating toward an enemy country that, according to everything she'd been taught, would devour her. They were given food, strange food, bread that tasted too white, meat with grease that clung to the lips. Some refused to eat, convinced it was laced with something. Others gobbled it down with shame, searing their throats. Every kindness felt like a trick. Every quiet night felt like bait. When the ship finally docked, there was no fanfare, no jeering crowds, only guards in wide-brimmed hats and soldiers with clipboards. The sun was sharp, the sky too blue, and the land open, too open. It was there, on the edge of that unfamiliar soil, that one woman whispered, "They're going to kill us slowly." But they didn't. They were loaded onto trucks, driven past cornfields and cattle, delivered to a ranch surrounded not by concrete or iron gates, but fences that could be climbed if they really wanted to. And yet they didn't run. They waited for the punishment to begin. They waited to be broken. What they got, instead, were rifles and men in cowboy hats. The trucks slowed to a crawl as they pulled into the ranch, tires stirring up spirals of dust that curled like smoke around the boots of the Americans waiting at the gate. There were no watchtowers, no barking dogs, no iron bars, just a sagging wooden arch that read Raven Hill Ranch, and a row of whitewashed fences that looked more decorative than secure. A horse snorted nearby. Somewhere, a rooster crowed like it didn't know the war had ended. The women stepped down one by one. They blinked against the sun. The air smelled not of rot or rust, but of hay, manure, and sweat. In the distance, cows wandered lazily across a dry pasture. It was not what they expected. No uniforms, no rifles raised. Just tall men in rolled-up sleeves, chewing tobacco, wearing denim overalls or leather vests, their faces red from the sun and lined from years in the field. One of them spat into the dirt and said, "Well, they're just girls." The women didn't know how to react to that. They stood stiff, back straight, hands still trembling from the long trip. Kiyomi scanned the yard for barbed wire and didn't see any. Mizuki kept her eyes on the ground. Another woman, Naomi, narrowed her gaze as if waiting for the trap to spring. But it didn't. The cowboy at the front, lean and tall, with a slight limp and a harmonica tucked in his breast pocket, tipped his hat. "This way," he said. The Japanese translator whispered the same in halting words. The women followed. Inside the bunkhouse, rows of wooden cots lined the walls. Thin mattresses, clean sheets. A small stove glowed in the corner. The floor was swept. One woman ran her fingers across a windowsill, expecting grime, but it was just dust. Nothing about it looked like a prison. Everything about it felt like a trick. The guards didn't bark orders. They didn't carry whips. One cowboy leaned against a doorframe, arms crossed, watching the new arrivals with the same expression he'd probably use for cattle being unloaded at market. Indifferent, bored, even. Another younger one, he couldn't have been older than 19, sat strumming a guitar with fingers that didn't look like they'd ever held a gun. In their world, authority had always worn severity like a badge. Officers had shouted, struck, and demanded total submission. These Americans barely spoke at all. When they did, it was slow, flat, and inflected with a drawl that made even English sound tired. They didn't threaten. They didn't sneer. They just let the women settle in. That was the most disorienting part. No beatings, no shouting, just quiet. On the second day, a bell rang at dawn. The women stirred from their bunks, half expecting roll call, punishment, or drills. Instead, they were led to a barn where metal trays were being filled with food. Real food, scrambled eggs, potatoes, bread with actual crusts. The air inside was thick with grease and warmth. Some of the women stared at the steam rising from the trays as if it were smoke from a distant battlefield. Others looked at the guards for a signal. Was this allowed? Was it safe? The cowboys just shrugged. Mizuki accepted a plate with shaking hands. Kiyomi stared at hers, unmoving. She had eaten rice boiled in rainwater, bark soaked in broth, but never this, never abundance. She sat on a bench and picked at the eggs. They were soft, buttery, almost sweet. Her throat tightened. The younger cowboy with the guitar passed behind her and whistled something low and tuneless. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't anything. Just a sound, floating through the mess hall like a breeze. And somehow, that broke her more than cruelty would have. Because there was no cruelty, no rage, just work, food, and the open space of a ranch where the wind touched your face like it belonged to you. The women had been prepared for cages, for degradation. Instead, they were ignored, not hated, not helped, just left alone. And in that silence, something began to stir. Not trust. Not yet. But the slow unraveling of fear, thread by thread. They still flinched at footsteps, still braced for blows. But the only thing that came was the sound of boots on wooden floors, the twang of a harmonica at dusk, and the lowing of cattle at sunrise. They were prisoners. But no one acted like it. And in that strange, maddening calm, their war didn't end. It started all over again inside. She sat cross-legged on a low wooden bench, the metal tray balanced in her lap, the smell of beef stew rising like smoke from a shrine. Her name was Naomi. She had not spoken aloud since the train ride to the coast. Her voice had curled inward, buried beneath weeks of whispers and thunderous silences. Now, in this strange place, she held a spoon in her hand and waited for the humiliation to come. It didn't. The mess hall was quiet, not silent, but soft boots scuffed against pine floors, tin cutlery clicked faintly against plates. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Across the room, one of the cowboys was teaching another how to crack eggs with one hand, laughing under his breath. None of them were watching her. None of them cared whether she lifted her spoon or dropped it. Naomi wasn't used to being invisible in this way, not ignored by command, but left alone to be a person. She had been promised something different. The officer in the evacuation barracks had said it coldly, without cruelty, like a man reporting the weather. They will strip you, not just your body, everything. They will humiliate you before they feed you. If they feed you. The women had whispered it to each other as the ship left the coast. If the Americans give you food, don't eat it too fast. Don't look grateful. Never say thank you. She raised the spoon slowly, the broth trembling inside it. The scent wrapped around her like a childhood dream, onions, oil, pepper. She hesitated. No one shouted. No one slapped the tray from her lap. She touched it to her lips, and her body betrayed her. The heat of it spread like a fuse being lit in her chest. The salt hit her tongue, then the richness of meat, a softness she hadn't tasted in years. Her jaw ached with the motion of chewing. She swallowed and felt her throat tighten. Not from hunger, but from the sob rising in her. She forced it down. Beside her, another woman stared straight ahead, chewing mechanically. Across the room, Kiyomi held her fork like a weapon, her knuckles white, every muscle in her body still coiled for some kind of punishment. But it never came. The cowboys didn't hover, didn't comment, didn't laugh. They just moved about the hall, collecting trays, pouring coffee for one another, refilling baskets of bread with the same casual rhythm they probably used on branding day. Naomi's second bite came faster, her third faster still. By the fourth, she was shaking. It wasn't the hunger, it was the kindness. That was worse, because kindness meant something was breaking. Her war-hardened skin, the brittle wall of loyalty and shame, built over years of propaganda and silence, it was beginning to crack in the most unexpected place. A mess hall with windows cracked open to let the late summer wind pass through, where no one watched her eat, where she was not being punished for survival. She paused, midway through the bowl, her spoon hovering. A memory surfaced. Her younger brother, Fumiaki, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor in their house in Yokohama, licking the last of the miso paste from a bowl while their mother whispered apologies over a pot of thin rice gruel. That was before the air raids, before the roof collapsed, before they stopped speaking of meals like they were real things. Naomi lowered her spoon. Her hands were trembling. She wiped her mouth with the edge of her sleeve, folded the half-empty tray in her arms, and stood up. Still no one looked. She wasn't used to this kind of freedom. The freedom to eat without being reduced, to exist without being dissected, to chew and swallow and not be told what it meant. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass. A bell rang in the distance, maybe for chores, maybe just to keep time. But inside the mess hall, Naomi placed her tray on the counter, nodded to the cook, who didn't even glance up, and walked out into the sun. Something inside her had changed, not because she was full, but because, for once, she was allowed to be. The next morning, they were called back to the field, the same dusty clearing, the same worn fence posts lined with rusting tin cans, the same rifles stacked neatly on a crate like instruments waiting for musicians who'd never learned to read music. The air was dry, the sun already sharp, but softer than the days before. Something had shifted. Naomi felt it in the way the women walked, not relaxed, not yet, but less brittle, less afraid of breaking. Mizuki stepped up first again. She adjusted her stance without help this time. She remembered what the cowboy had said, "Let the rifle do the work." She exhaled, aimed, fired. The can leapt off the post like it had been yanked by string. The cowboy nodded, silent approval in his jawline. Then Kiyomi stepped forward. She had never even touched a rifle in Japan. Not once. It was forbidden, sacred. She picked it up anyway, her fingers tentative but unflinching. The metal was cool in her grip. Not like death, not like violence, just solid. She raised it slowly, like she was lifting a question she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. She aimed. The cowboy beside her said nothing. The recoil surprised her. The tin can flew, missed by inches, and the sound cracked across the field like a whip. But it was what came next that no one expected. Kiyomi laughed, a short, startled, irreverent laugh, like a hiccup of joy she hadn't authorized. She lowered the gun, blinked, and covered her mouth. But it was too late. The others had heard it. Mizuki turned. Naomi's eyes went wide. One of the cowboys raised an eyebrow. The young one, the one with the guitar, grinned. "You all right?" he asked, amused. Kiyomi nodded, still half laughing. "It's louder than I thought," she said, her accent thick but clear. "Like thunder, but funnier." The other women didn't know how to react. Laughter hadn't been allowed in their war, not real laughter. Not the kind that wasn't forced into polite smiles or masked behind obedience. But Kiyomi's laugh had been real, and once it slipped out, it became something contagious. The next woman up, Aiko, giggled as she missed her first shot. Then the woman after her grinned when she knocked over 2 cans in a row. Naomi tried and flinched so hard she nearly dropped the rifle, then doubled over in silent laughter of her own. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't disrespect. It was release. The cowboys didn't stop them, didn't scold them. They leaned against the fence, arms crossed, dust clinging to their boots, watching this line of enemy women discover the absurdity of a moment that made no sense in any military manual. The rifle, once a symbol of death and obedience, had become a challenge, a puzzle, a game, and their reactions weren't met with discipline but with nods, small smirks, and a kind of cautious pride. One older cowboy, leathery-faced and slow-moving, walked down the line, stopping behind Kiyomi. "That's a good shot," he said, voice low. "You hold steady like you've been doing this all your life." She looked at him, unsure if he was teasing. "I haven't," she said quietly. He tipped his hat. "Could have fooled me." By the end of the hour, the clearing had changed. It wasn't just a firing range anymore. It was something in between a classroom and a campfire. The laughter had softened the edges of fear, chipped away at the stone that war had carved into their shoulders. No one was told to be silent. No one was punished for smiling. For the first time since the war began, these women weren't being told how to feel. They were just allowed to be surprised by it, by the weight of a rifle that didn't threaten them, by the sound of metal hitting metal, by the sound of their own laughter echoing into the Texas sky. And in that moment, the gun felt less like a weapon and more like a question they were finally allowed to answer. That night, the lamps burned low in the barracks, their light softened by dust and exhaustion. The women lay on their cots in a quiet that felt different from the silence they had known before. It was not the silence of fear or waiting. It was the kind that settled after a long day of movement, when the body remembered it was alive. Outside, crickets sang in uneven rhythm, and somewhere far off, a horse shifted its weight in the dark. Kiyomi lay awake, staring at the underside of her blanket. The laughter from the firing range still echoed in her ears, startling in its unfamiliarity. She had not laughed like that since before the war, before the uniforms, before the endless instructions whispered through clenched teeth, before she learned how to disappear. She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a small, folded notebook. It was thin, its pages uneven, the edges softened from being handled too often. She had kept it hidden since the transport ship, pressed flat beneath her clothes, a private rebellion folded into paper. Writing had once been forbidden, unless it was for orders, lists, or reports. Personal thoughts were considered indulgent, dangerous. But she had written anyway, always in secret. She opened the notebook carefully, as though the paper might cry out. The pencil felt strange in her fingers now, lighter than the rifle, lighter than the weight she had carried inside her chest for years. She hesitated, then began to write, slowly, deliberately, shaping each character as if it might vanish if she rushed. "Today I held a gun and did not feel afraid." The words surprised her. She read them again. She had expected guilt, shame. Instead, there was something else. Uncertainty, yes, but also curiosity. She remembered the sound of the shot, the way the recoil had nudged her shoulder, the way the other women had laughed. Laughter, not forced, not brittle, real. She had been taught that women were vessels, not voices, that their strength was in endurance, not expression, that silence was virtue. Even her name had been spoken less and less as the war dragged on, replaced by tasks, numbers, orders barked from men who never learned to see her face. She had become invisible in plain sight. But today, someone had watched her, not as a soldier, not as a subject, as a person. She wrote again. They did not tell me to be quiet. The words trembled on the page. Across the room, another woman shifted in her sleep. Someone coughed. The lamp flickered. The world felt fragile and unreal, like it might dissolve if she breathed too deeply. But she kept writing. She wrote about the sound of the rifle, about the dust rising in the air, about the way her heart had pounded, not with fear, but with something like pride. She remembered being a girl, years ago, tracing her name in the dirt outside her family's home. Her mother had scolded her for it. "That's not useful," she'd said. "Your hands are meant for work." And so, Kiyomi had learned to erase herself, to make space for others. Now, with the pencil moving across the page, she felt something unfold inside her. Not rebellion, not defiance, something quieter. Ownership. She wrote until the lamp burned low. In the morning, she folded the page carefully and tucked it back into her blouse. It wasn't meant to be read by anyone else. It was proof she existed, proof that she had felt something beyond fear and hunger, proof that she had been more than a body following orders. Outside, the camp stirred to life. Boots scraped. Voices called out. A harmonica began to play somewhere near the fence line. She stood, smoothed her shirt, and stepped into the light. For the first time in a long while, she carried something that could not be taken from her. Her voice. The next week, when the women were brought to the range again, something had changed. The cans were gone. In their place were paper targets nailed to broad wooden boards, blank circles, black rings, dotted lines. No faces, no silhouettes, just shapes, impersonal, abstract, unthreatening. It was the kind of target you'd see at a fairground, not a battlefield. And that, perhaps, was the point. By now, the rifles no longer felt foreign in their hands. There was a rhythm to it: shoulder, aim, breath, fire, lower. It became a kind of ceremony, not sacred, but not empty either. A quiet ritual that carved out a space between past and present, between what the gun had meant and what it meant now. There was no command to shoot, no barked countdown, just quiet nods from the cowboys and the shuffle of boots in the dust. The repetition soothed them. It required focus, but not fear. And with each shot, the war moved further away, not erased, but blurred, like a painting smudged by time. Kiyomi took her stance. She focused on the center of the circle, not because she hated anything, not because she needed to win, but because, for once, she was allowed to concentrate on something that didn't hurt. She fired. The paper trembled, then held. She exhaled. The smell of gunpowder clung to the wind. It was strangely comforting. Behind her, Naomi leaned in close to whisper, "You clipped the edge." Kiyomi nodded. "Closer than yesterday." Naomi smiled, quick, small, but real. "You'll get the center tomorrow." They began to compete, not for medals or rank or praise, just for the satisfaction of control. It was not a contest of dominance. It was a practice of precision, of presence, the kind of joy a child might feel stacking stones until they balanced, then knocking them down again. It was play. The guards noticed. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a slow drawl and a kind smile, started keeping track, quietly. He'd murmur, "3 for 3, or "That one kissed the bullseye," and move along without fanfare. His voice became a kind of scoreboard, low, encouraging, never mocking. There was no prize. And yet the women began to look forward to the range. It became a part of their day, like meals or chores. Even those who never spoke took part, lining up, taking aim, resetting. The repetition grounded them. It stripped the weapon of its venom. The rifle wasn't a symbol anymore. It was a tool, a puzzle, a game. One afternoon, Mizuki turned to Naomi after hitting the innermost ring and said, "My brother would never believe this." Naomi laughed. "Mine would say it's impossible." Mizuki stared at her target. "Maybe it is, but here we are." There was something miraculous in that they could stand in the open sun, with rifles in hand, shooting at paper, and feel no hatred, no need to justify it, just the pure sensation of doing something with precision and purpose. It was healing in its own quiet way. They didn't shoot to destroy. They shot to feel real, to feel capable, to mark the passage of time with something other than hunger and shame. And in that small clearing, with the soft thud of paper shaking under bullet strikes, they began to reclaim a part of themselves. There were no enemies here, only targets, circles, rings, things that could be hit or missed without consequence. And in that strange freedom, they found something they hadn't expected: peace. It happened quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony, just a moment between chores and dusk, when the sun was sinking low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the firing range. Her name was Hana. She was the youngest among them, barely old enough to have seen a winter without air raid drills. Her hands were small, quick, often trembling in the morning cold. But when she held her rifle, they stilled. She didn't say it out loud at first. She only whispered it to herself as she lay prone on the dirt, lining up her shot. "Sky," she murmured. The rifle didn't respond, of course. But the name hung there in the space between breath and recoil. Sky. It felt right. Not because the weapon reminded her of war, but because when she held it, she had to look up above the barrel, beyond the paper target, into something wide and unknowable, something that had not yet been taken from her. That evening, as the others washed up or rested on their bunks, Hana stayed behind for a few minutes longer. She crouched near the woodpile where the spare rifles were kept, glanced over her shoulder, and pulled a small sliver of metal from her sock, a button torn from an old uniform, sharpened into a wedge. With careful, deliberate strokes, she began to carve. ZSKY. The letters were shallow, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But to Hana, they were a flag planted in forbidden soil, a quiet act of ownership, not over the gun, but over herself. The next morning, one of the cowboys noticed. He picked up the rifle, turned it in his hands, and raised an eyebrow. "Sky, huh?" he said with a chuckle. Hana froze. Her ears burned. He handed it back without another word, the corner of his mouth tilting up just slightly. "Good name. Good. Good." That was all. But it meant everything. That night, as the lamps flickered in the barracks and the scent of soap and hay lingered in the air, Hana sat on her bunk and cleaned her rifle with slow, deliberate care. She moved the cloth along the barrel the way one might polish a family heirloom. Then, softly, barely audible, she began to hum. It was a song her mother used to sing while cooking rice, a lullaby of mountains and rivers, taught to her before the war, when their home still had a roof and laughter. The melody wavered in places, forgotten words, broken rhythms, but it floated gently through the room, catching the attention of the others. One by one, Heads turned. No one said a word. After a moment, Kiyomi joined in, humming in harmony. Then Mizuki, her voice fragile but steady. Within minutes, the barracks were filled with the low, woven sound of something ancient, something soft, not military chants, not propaganda hymns, but folk songs tied to kitchens, gardens, and the wind rustling through pine trees. The cowboys outside paused, unsure whether to intervene. They didn't. Inside, the women hummed and sang until their voices trailed off into sleep. A rifle named Sky lay quietly against the wall, its stock still warm from the touch of hands that no longer trembled. And in that quiet, something unspeakable had been reclaimed. The right to feel, to remember, to belong to something other than war. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, like the video and comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The letter was never meant to be read by a commanding officer. It was meant for a younger brother, barely 15, who had cried when Hana was conscripted and had given her his favorite coin for luck. She had tucked that coin into her boot and carried it across an ocean, through a prison, and now into the unlikeliest corner of America. She wanted him to know she was alive. But she also wanted him to know something else, something she herself was only beginning to understand. So she wrote. She wrote about the rifle named Sky, about the cowboy who winked but never mocked her aim, about the girl who could hum lullabies again. She wrote about the shooting contest that had taken place the week before, when the guards, half in jest, half in boredom, invited the women to compete. A can of peaches was the prize. Hana had accepted the challenge. She won. She described the shot in detail, the weight of the rifle, the blur of the target, the way the can had exploded in a puff of juice and laughter. One of the cowboys had taken off his hat and bowed, dramatically, as if in a samurai film. It was absurd and wonderful and terrifying. And so she wrote, "I beat an American with a gun, and he thanked me for it." The letter passed through hands in the Red Cross. It passed through a translator who smiled and said nothing. It passed through a censor's desk, though by what oversight or weariness it wasn't redacted, no one could say. Eventually, it reached Kyoto, folded inside another envelope, stamped and sealed and placed in a stack of wartime correspondence no one quite knew what to do with. It landed on a desk that belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Ishikawa, who had overseen propaganda dissemination for the Home Ministry. He was a meticulous man, known for his precision and his unshakable loyalty. He read the letter twice. Then a third time. He didn't understand. A Japanese prisoner of war, held by the enemy, was being taught how to shoot, was winning contests, was being applauded, was naming her rifle after the Sky. It contradicted everything. The Americans were monsters, soulless occupiers who fed prisoners slop and worked them to death. That was what they had printed. That was what the people had been told. But this letter smelled of stew and dust and gun oil. It hummed with laughter and odd little joys. It didn't accuse or cry for help. It simply described something human. He folded the page and stared at it. Was it a joke? A plant? Or worse, was it true? The implications rattled. If prisoners were laughing, if they were being treated with dignity, even in enemy camps, what did that say about the righteousness of their suffering? What did it say about sacrifice? What did it do to the carefully polished myth of noble defeat? He stared at the peach-colored envelope for a long time, then slid it into a drawer, behind a stack of dull logistics reports. He never spoke of it again. But for Hana, the letter had done what it needed to. Somewhere across the sea, her brother would read her words and know she was not broken, that she had survived not just the war, but the silence after it. that she had picked up a rifle and somehow laughed. And that, maybe, was its own kind of rebellion, a whisper that reached across barbed wire and borders, and landed, softly, in Kyoto. The morning the list was posted, the camp felt different, quieter. The wind carried a weight that had nothing to do with weather. Names were read aloud, one by one, each followed by a pause long enough for the meaning to settle. Repatriation. The word moved through the women like a tremor. Some stared at the ground. Others looked up at the sky as if trying to see the future written there. A few wept. A few smiled. Most did neither. They had learned not to trust joy until it proved it could stay. Hannah stood in line with her hands folded, her posture straight but unforced. She had changed since the day she arrived, not in any way that could be measured on a scale or chart, but her shoulders no longer curled inward. Her eyes met the world directly now. When her name was called, she stepped forward without hesitation. That afternoon, the Cowboys gathered the women near the barn one last time. The rifles had been cleaned and stacked away, the targets taken down. There would be no more practice, no more laughter echoing off the hills. One of the men cleared his throat and asked, a little awkwardly, if anyone needed anything before they left. Supplies, paper, shoes. Hannah raised her hand. The men turned to her, surprised. She hesitated only a moment. A ribbon, she said. For my hair. The Cowboys exchanged looks. Then one of them smiled. Another nodded. Within an hour, a truck was sent into town. When it returned, a small bundle was placed in her hands, thin, pale pink, folded carefully. She held it like something sacred. That night, she sat on her bunk and braided her hair slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had once taught her. The ribbon slid through her fingers like water. When she tied it, she did not look in a mirror. She didn't need to. She could feel the difference. The next morning, the women lined up to board the transport. The ranch looked smaller now, the fence lower, the fields wider. The Cowboys stood off to the side, hats in hand. No speeches, no salutes, just quiet watching. As Hannah stepped onto the truck, she paused. The sun caught the ribbon and lit it like a flame. One of the Cowboys tipped his hat. Another raised 2 fingers in a small salute. She nodded back, just once. Not in gratitude, in recognition. The engine turned over. The truck rolled forward. As the camp faded behind her, Hannah touched the ribbon again. It wasn't decoration. It was memory made visible. It was the sound of laughter on a firing range, the warmth of a bowl of stew, the feeling of holding a rifle without fear, the knowledge that she had been seen not as an enemy, not as a victim, but as herself. When the truck passed the last fence, she didn't look back. She looked ahead, toward a country she barely recognized, toward a future that would not be kind, but would at least be hers. The ribbon fluttered in the wind, bright against her dark hair, a small defiance against everything that had tried to erase her. And in that quiet motion, as the road unspooled beneath her, she carried with her something no one could take away, the certainty that she had survived, the knowledge that she had lived, and the unshakable truth that even in the ruins of war, something human had endured. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering the stories history almost forgot.